Hi everyone, I'm Ara Lanaya, and this is my Advanced Dynamics final project, Dynamics and Stability of the Spring-Loaded Inverted Pendulum Model, oftentimes just known as SLIP. So this model is a two-phase hybrid dynamics model that we used to kind of simulate what it would be like for a lead to be running. Maybe it's used a lot in humanoid robotics where you have a robot that needs to walk around kind of the same way a human does, or in biomechanics where we're trying to model the dynamics of their knee and their lead as they go through space. The model is comprised of two stages. You have the inverse pendulum stage where you see the foot is touching the ground. We have the lead kind of represented by this spring as there's some compression in your body as you step, and you have the knee up here at the top. Then, as you lift your foot off the ground, you transition into this simple projectile motion state where we are assuming the lead is massless, and we're just kind of worried about where the knee is going to end up as the lead goes from step to step. So, like I said, we have two basic dynamics that we need to analyze. We need to look at the flight phase, which I modeled in Cartesian coordinates as just a simple projectile motion. It was actually a lot of fun to use simple projectile motion, to use Lagrange's equations on it, because Lagrange's equations are typically for harder problems, but you can still apply them to simple ones. And then I had the stance phase, which I modeled in polar coordinates, and that was, we worked out in a spring pendulum in class, so now it's just about inverting that and what that does to the relationship with gravity and the angle theta. So we have were three main phases to this. The model first has the alternating projectile phase and spring-loaded phase, where you're kind of transitioning from these states. Then I modeled the actual touchdown. So we have our two states, but we need to worry about the in between. So when the foot touches down, we need to have the initial model accurately represent that by figuring out where the foot would be relative to the knee, and figuring out at the time at which those coordinates will be touching the ground. And then a similar thing with the inverse pendulum, just when has the what the condition I used was actually when the spring was fully uncompressed. That was essentially our foot had just come off the ground. We weren't, or the lead, I should say. We weren't squeezed down, and we were able to step off. We had stepped off the ground. So first you define your states, then you define the transitions between them. Then finally I created a 1D apex map, which was essentially just looking at our system and saying, hey, we don't necessarily care about what's going on in between, where we're like stepping down, compressing, stepping back up. We really want to look at the hop to hop dynamics of the system, and you essentially just look at, here's the knee after one date, here's the knee after another hop. Where's the knee ending up? Where are our what's it called? Our final points of where where the system is gonna rest. So that's kind of what the last phase of this project was, just looking at where the system was stable or not stable points. Yes. Then, after I had developed the complete model, I verified it using energy conservation. If you noticed, I have not mentioned any losses due to friction or any of that, and that is because generally these models do not take that into account. Obviously, we know that as you're pushing onto the floor, you're dispersing some energy onto the ground. Sorry about that. Obviously, we know as you step onto the ground, you're dispersing some energy, there's some heat being created. But for this model, we didn't even need to go as far as modeling that, because just knowing where the knee ends up kind of gives us enough information about the person and how they're walking. That does mean, though, that I was able to use energy conservation to verify the model. As I simulated my system that I had come up with, I was able to track the drift in total energy over time, and found that over a series of 100 hops or so, we only lost about 6.17 times 10 to the negative 13 energy, which is about machine precision, about how much you can hope for when you're having round off error within every iteration. So that was very good to show that the model was, at least obeying the laws of physics as we have them. So then I did do a massive parameter sweep to try to identify. So there were two big parameters here that I played around with. There was the touchdown angle, which was, as part of the assumptions of this project, it's as the knee is in the air, it's gonna hold some constant angle You're the step, you're the lift off at some angle, and you're the touchdown at that same angle. And so that was one parameter, our touchdown angle theta TD. And then another one was how stiff is the lead. Obviously if we make it super unstiff, then it's just not realistic. It's not modeling what the actual lead looks like. But we know that a lead is going to compress as you put it under load. So that will also affect the dynamics of the model. And what I essentially found, what this graph is showing, is that there was some almost parabolic or exponential relationship between the touchdown angle and the lead stiffness, where this green region is representing, hey, this is where the model is actually stable. We are looking at the 1D apex map, and the knee position is not drifting too much over time. Whereas in all these other regions, we would have wild oscillations up and down, and it would just not end up. It was not very consistent. The system was unstable. It was all drifting off until other values. So I thought this was very interesting, just the way that the angle at which you hold your knee is correlated to the stiffness, and how, in a way, this kind of points towards, hey, if measure your lead stiffness, and then that's like the optimal angle you should be holding at for running, at least to keep a stable knee as you're walking around, if that's something you care about. So I found that to be very interesting. So, just to review, I found that, small perturbations would kind of result in us converging as this kind of staircase format. We found the stable point. Now let's shift both of them up a little, still stable, shift both of them all up. Whereas if we had any big perturbations on either of the parameters, we would just have this crazy oscillatory divergence. And the apex heights would alternate the size of the fits points and kind of grow on each hop, which was kind of interesting to think about. You're stepping, but your angle's off, so your knee is kind of sporadically moving to different places. Then finally, I did just look at the bifurcation in the phase space of the lead. I looked at the angle theta over theta dot, and also the radius of the lead over the velocity of it. And what we found is that stability was kind of lost sharply at the edges of the stable window, but it didn't really branch out. Whereas for the stance phase portraits, the stance trajectories would form open arcs in phase space. You can kind of see these big arcs. This was over different initial angle touchdown angles, but they would form these big arcs. And as we had steeper angles, that would kind of produce shorter, less compressed arcs of the lead is starting here, going here in phase space, and it has reached another stable point. So it's interesting to see how that relationship changed as you modified that touchdown angle. So some key insights were that just finding a periodic solution did not guarantee it would be stable. Most of the scenarios I looked at were actually unstable, which was kind of interesting to find out that the model is actually relatively unstable unless you're at one of the known stable stiffness and touchdown angles. And then also thinking about the impact that this model can have on the robotics field when it's actually applied, because it is incredibly mathematically simple. I was able to code it over the span of a couple days. It was fairly accurate to the real world, obeyed the energy conservation, and could probably benefit from maybe working on different swap conditions for when the lead was fully released, and including friction and other losses into that. But it is a relatively simple model that accurately portrays the dynamics of the system, and as such, it is actively used to kind of control the strategies that real running robots are going to use. And so because of that, I found it to be a very useful model to kind of learn and understand, and it was a great first introduction to hybrid dynamics. And when you have a system in one state that you then need to swap those states and identify the transitions for it, I found it to be really good practice for that. So anyways, thank you so much for watching my presentation. Hopefully you learned at least a thing or two about how the SLIM model works, and I would appreciate all questions and feedback. Thank you so much.